Kyle threw the money in his face, right in his face. Bills scattered across the floor as he smirked. "Maybe you'd be better off digging through a dumpster." Laughter echoed around the store. No one stepped in. No one said a word. Everyone just watched as he was humiliated. But in just 1 week, this homeless man would walk into that same store and fire Kyle in front of everyone. How? What happened next would shock even those who thought they'd seen it all. But let's start from the beginning. The streets of Manhattan buzzed with life. People in expensive coats and tailored suits rushed to work. Cars honked in the morning traffic, and the air was filled with the rich aroma of coffee from street cafes. But for Robert Miller, this world had long since become foreign. He walked slowly, as if every movement took effort. His clothes, an old faded trench coat and tattered boots, stood in stark contrast to the polished storefronts. His hair was unkempt, and his hands trembled from the morning cold. Once, he used to walk into these stores like he belonged. Now he was just a passerby, someone people pretended not to see. For days, he had survived on scraps, whatever he could find. His stomach ached from hunger. He needed to buy something. Anything. Before him stood an upscale grocery store, Grant's finest. He glanced at the spotless glass doors, through which shelves of fine cheeses, fresh fruit, and gourmet meats were visible. Inside, everything was bright, pristine, perfectly arranged. It had been years since Robert had stepped into a store like this. But today, he had no choice. Taking a deep breath, he pushed open the door. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm bread filled the air. Customers strolled leisurely through the aisles, chatting casually. Unlike the frantic pace of regular supermarkets, this place was for those who never had to worry about prices. Robert made his way to the bread section. He picked the simplest loaf, reached for the cheapest carton of milk with a trembling hand, and walked to the register. Behind the counter stood Kyle Foster, a young clerk, barely in his 30s. Tall, well-groomed, his neatly styled hair made it look like he had just stepped out of a high-end salon. Kyle lazily glanced at Robert, but the moment he took in his clothes, a look of disgust crossed his face. "Hey, are you sure you're here to shop?" he asked mockingly, folding his arms across his chest. Robert didn't respond. He simply placed the bread and milk on the counter. Kyle didn't move. Instead, he let out a loud scoff, making sure the customers nearby heard him. "Seriously? You sure you can afford this?" Robert nodded. But Kyle wasn't planning to just ring him up. A smirk tugged at his lips, as if he was enjoying this. "Let's see the cash. Or were you hoping I'd give you a handout?" By now, people were turning to watch. A woman in a fur coat sneered. An elderly man shook his head, as if to say, "What's he doing here?" Slowly, Robert reached into his pocket. His fingers grasped a few crumpled bills. He pulled them out and placed them on the counter. Kyle looked at the money, then back at Robert, and laughed. "You're serious?" He picked up the bills between 2 fingers, as if they were filthy, and held them up for everyone to see. "What, are we running a charity now? Or did you think this was some kind of soup kitchen?" Robert felt something tighten inside him. He wanted to leave, to disappear, to vanish. But Kyle wasn't done. "Listen, old man, you're out of your league here. Maybe you should try the dumpster out back instead." Soft chuckles rippled through the store. One shopper smirked. Another merely shot a disdainful glance before turning away. Robert stood still, feeling the heat rise in his face. He wanted to say something, but what? Kyle sighed dramatically and opened the cash register. All right, I'm just messing with you. Maybe you'll get lucky, and this pile of pocket change will actually be enough." He started counting the money, painfully slow, dragging the moment out. And then, suddenly, he clenched the bills into his fist. Robert flinched. Kyle grinned and, with all his strength, threw the money back at him. "Oh man, my bad, old-timer. Looks like you're a little short." The bills scattered across the floor. Robert stared at them. He couldn't believe this was happening. Laughter rippled through the store again. Some people turned away, pretending they hadn't seen anything. Others watched silently. But no one intervened. Robert said nothing. He simply knelt down and began collecting his money from the floor. Kyle folded his arms, smirking. "That's right. Know your place next time." Robert stood up. Looking Kyle straight in the eyes, he spoke softly, yet clearly. "I'll remember this day." And without another word, he walked out. Robert sat on a wooden bench in a small park, his back pressed against the rough planks. His hands trembled, his breathing was heavy. He stared at the gray asphalt beneath him, oblivious to the people passing by. He had been humiliated. Again. Beside him lay his meager money, the same bills Kyle had thrown in his face. He clenched his fists. Once, he had an office in a skyscraper on Fifth Avenue. Once, his name carried weight in business meetings. Once, he dined in expensive restaurants and wore custom-tailored suits. And now? Now people didn't even consider him human. The passers-by didn't look in his direction. They were either in a hurry or pretending he didn't exist. They didn't see a man who had lost everything. Robert closed his eyes. Memories flooded back, one after another. "Mr. Miller, I'm afraid we have bad news. The market has crashed. Your assets are frozen. You are no longer the CEO. I'm sorry, but the bank is forced to foreclose on your home." He had lost everything. His company, his home, his money, his family. And no one had come to help. A voice from the past. "Robert?" He flinched and slowly lifted his head. Standing before him was a man in a perfectly tailored, expensive suit. Someone he hadn't seen in 10 years. David Houston. Once, David had been his business partner. They built a company together, sat at the same negotiation tables, toasted to success. But when the crisis hit, when Robert lost everything, David vanished from his life. "My God, it's really you!" David's voice was filled with shock. Robert stared at him in silence. How many times had he imagined this moment? How many times had he pictured someone from his past seeing what he had become and simply asking how he was? But he never thought it would be David. "Damn, Robert. I can't believe this." David sat down beside him, running his hands through his hair. How did this happen?" Robert let out a bitter chuckle. "You know how." David fell silent. He did know. They all did. They all watched him fall, but none of them reached out. "I thought you disappeared," David finally said. "I looked for you. I swear. But you just vanished." Robert slowly nodded. "Yeah, I vanished because no one needed me." A pause settled between them. For the first time in years, Robert looked into the eyes of someone from his past and felt no anger, only exhaustion. David exhaled, rubbed his face, then pulled out his wallet. "Look, I want to help you." He held out several $100 bills. Robert looked at the money, then at David, and shook his head. "You think I'm asking for charity?" David froze. No, of course not. I didn't take handouts when I was at the top, and I won't start now." Robert slowly stood up. "You want to help me? Then don't throw money at me like Kyle did." David frowned. "Kyle? Who's Kyle?" Robert looked at him, and suddenly, for the first time in a long time, he felt something spark inside him. For years, he had accepted his fate. But today, something changed. Kyle is the guy who thinks I'm a nobody. He took a deep breath, squaring his shoulders. I think it's time to prove him wrong. David watched him in silence. Then a small smile formed on his lips. So, you're still the same Robert Miller I once knew? Robert nodded. Yes, he was still Robert Miller. A week had passed. Robert stood in front of the mirror in the hotel room David had rented for him. The glow of the lamp illuminated his face, where for the first time in years, confidence had returned. He looked like a businessman again. The suit fit perfectly. The crisp white shirt was freshly pressed. His hair was no longer dirty and unkempt. He now resembled the man he once was at the peak of his success. But most importantly, he felt like Robert Miller again. Over the past few days, he had attended dozens of meetings, reconnected with contacts he thought were long lost. As it turned out, some people still remembered who he was. And now, standing in front of the mirror, he knew the time had come. Saturday afternoon. Grant's Finest was bustling with customers. Kyle Foster, as usual, stood behind the register, lazily scrolling through his phone. The store was full of shoppers, but he barely paid them any attention. In his mind, everything was fine. His life was under control. But at that very moment, a sleek black car with tinted windows pulled up in front of the store. The door opened, and two men in expensive suits stepped out. Behind them was a man Kyle had already forgotten. But the moment he looked up, his heart stopped. Robert Miller. The same homeless man he had mocked just a week ago. But the man standing before him now was no beggar. Now, he was a powerful, commanding presence, someone whose mere appearance demanded respect. Kyle swallowed hard as sweat began to form on his forehead. What the hell is he doing here? Robert entered the store with a slight smile, his eyes scanning the aisles as if he were inspecting his domain. And, in a way, he was. From the back office emerged Mr. Grant himself, the owner of the store chain. A short, balding man in an elegant gray suit, he quickly approached Robert and extended his hand. Mr. Miller, it's a pleasure to see you. The paperwork is ready, just as you requested. Kyle's mouth went dry. Paperwork? He froze, his breath quickening. Something was about to happen, something he wasn't prepared for. Robert took the documents, skimmed through them, and nodded calmly. Perfect. This store is now mine. Kyle's world shattered. What? He took a step forward, struggling to process what he had just heard. Wait. Is this some kind of joke? But Mr. Grant turned to him, his expression cold and serious. No, Kyle. It's reality. Grant's Finest now belongs to Mr. Miller. Kyle's mouth opened, but no words came out. Robert simply looked at him. That same look, the one Kyle had seen a week ago, when he humiliated him in front of everyone. But now it was the look of a winner. I don't understand, Kyle mumbled, gripping the cash register like it could somehow save him. Robert smirked. You told me I wasn't on your level, remember? Kyle felt his throat tighten. Robert slowly stepped closer, resting his hands on the counter. But now, this is my store. A stunned silence filled the store. Customers stopped in their tracks. Employees froze, afraid to even breathe. Kyle stared at Robert in disbelief, and then it hit him. His life was falling apart, right in front of his eyes. Robert turned to Mr. Grant. I don't need employees who disgrace my business. Grant nodded. Of course. Kyle, you're fired. Kyle's body stiffened. No. Wait, this is a mistake. He turned to Robert in desperation. I was just, you know, just humiliating people? Robert asked calmly. Kyle fell silent. Robert stared at him for a moment longer, then gestured toward the exit. Get out. Kyle stood there, completely in shock, but he had no choice. His hands trembled as he untied his apron, letting it fall onto the counter. Then, with slow, hesitant steps, he walked toward the door. The moment it closed behind him, Robert took a deep breath. He glanced around the store. Once, this place had been a site of his humiliation. Now, it was his. And this was only the beginning. Same store, same walls, same shelves stocked with elite goods. But now, everything was different. Customers whispered among themselves, exchanging glances. Some even tried to discreetly snap a photo of the new owner of the store. The same people who hadn't even looked Robert's way a week ago now avoided making eye contact. Because now, he was at the top. Robert took a step forward and looked at the employees. They all stood in silence, as if awaiting their fate. They had seen what happened to Kyle, and they knew their future was now in his hands. How many of you saw me being humiliated here last week? He asked calmly, without a hint of anger in his voice. No one answered. He smirked. All of you. People lowered their eyes. Some clearly wished they could disappear. Robert glanced at them once more before speaking again. I'm not here for revenge. I don't need revenge. That's not why I came back. He picked up a piece of paper from the counter and placed it in front of him. But from this moment on, things will be different. No one in this store will ever be humiliated again. Every single person who works here needs to understand one thing. Respect is everything. He lifted his gaze. It doesn't matter who walks through that door, a man in an expensive suit or someone in a worn-out coat. Everyone will be treated the same. This is my only rule. A heavy silence filled the store. Then, after a few seconds, one of the employees, a senior cashier who had worked there for years, started clapping. One by one, others joined in. And soon, the entire staff was applauding their new owner. That evening, as the store closed for the night, Robert stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air. He knew that today, he hadn't just changed his own life, he had changed the lives of others too. But then, across the street, he noticed a familiar figure. Kyle. He stood leaning against a lamppost. His once expensive uniform had been replaced with a simple hoodie. He looked lost. Robert walked closer. Couldn't find a new job? Kyle clenched his fists, but said nothing. Robert studied him for a moment. You were so sure you'd always be at the top, but life has a way of reminding us that no one is safe from falling. Kyle remained silent. A week ago, you laughed at me, and now, I could be the one laughing. He paused. But I won't. Kyle's head snapped up. Robert met his eyes and said firmly, If you want your life back, learn to respect people. Then, maybe, you'll get another chance. Kyle stared at him for a few seconds, then nodded and walked away without a word. Robert smiled. He knew he had made the right choice. He hadn't just regained his dignity, he had become stronger than ever, and this was only the beginning.